Please say that you all recognize, I'm sure, that this is a special space that you're in right now. Dr. Williams, Dr. Carr, the whole group of freshman seminar, that whole team, it's just an honor to be asked to sit down and say something to you all, in this setting. 2019 is going to be a special, special year. There's no doubt about that. There is a reservation, and it's a quote that you all will see a lot. And it's a quote that has its problems, but it talks about each generation must, out of relative obscurity, find its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. That when we have these intergenerational conversations, we have to be very careful that from our side, from the side of those that were a little bit further down the road, we're not too heavy-handed with it. And on the other hand, we want to make certain that we don't leave you without guidance. So I was reluctant to talk about some of the things that we were going to talk about, but we had a visit about maybe a month ago now from one of the individuals who really started the area of black psychology, Wade Nobles, and he has a book out that's called The Island of Memes, which I thought was an interesting book. And his conversation with us this semester kind of got me going again and gave me some real direction on where we could possibly go with something like this. The concept of memes in his book is this idea that there's sort of like a unit in the brain, it's an information unit in the brain that has adaptive consequences and is passed on within a culture. This is the notion of a meme, and it can take the form of words, images, custom sounds, mannerisms. All of these things are what he calls memes in the brain, and he said there also can be what he calls mimetic infection, where we can get foreign or alien memes in our brains, and that's problematic. But what he was talking about is that Haiti has a special meme that it's exhibited over time. And we see this also, we saw a special meme also exhibited during Katrina in New Orleans. And we're seeing it now as state-sponsored violence kills our young people. There's a meme, and this meme really centered around a resistance meme that he talks about. And it's something that we have to keep in mind. It's there, it's in us, and it's worth talking about, and it's worth discussing in an intergenerational conversation. The levees broke, but we didn't. This is an interesting picture for me because these are individuals who, in one case, the case of the young man, had been buried in the Haitian earthquake for around 29 days. The woman had been buried around 9 to 13 days. And these are individuals who simply defied any kind of a notion of how long a person can live without food, water, or in those conditions. But there's a resistance that's part of our fabric. And I thought that was interesting. There's also this idea that, they come by tens to do things to us, but they think we're asleep, and we're not. All right, we're not asleep. We're not sleeping. In fact, you find that that resistance meme is part of who we are. So I wanted to start off with poetry, if I could. And this one I think you'll find interesting. This is from my side of the coin. Says this: we dreamed you black in your badness, made you up out of poems and lies and words to live by. And we ourselves were dreamed most likely by some slaves, whenever they got a little space to climb into their heads and be free. So when they closed their eyes, what did they see? They saw you. They saw me. That's one poem. Another poem. We dreamed you black, right? Again, but wouldn't you know we've been hurt, been down before, nigger. When my pride was low, looking at the world like, where do we go, nigger? And we hate po-po, want to kill us dead in the streets for sure, nigger. At the preacher's door, right? My knees getting weak, my gun might blow, but we're going to be all right. All right? I like the first one. Here's what we got to do, and we've got to do it, but it can be done. I really want to just say to you something about this whole notion of race and then the idea of racism. We need to talk about that for diagnostic purposes, and then for treatment purposes, we've got to deal with this whole idea of restoration and renaissance. Those are the two things that we will do. And I want to use the book that you all just finished, Between the World and Me, sort of as a guide with certain quotes working through this to kind of keep us on track. Part one, really now, you've got the references, right? Everybody got the references for this? You're already through with part one, the prelude. There were references in the prelude. Now we're to part one. We'll go through that. Biological status of race and the conceptual status of racism. Simply, and you'll hear Dr. Fatima Jackson talk about this, that in biology, you talk about a subspecies or a race when you have sharply defined unique traits within a species. They show clear and private genetic lineages. That is, there's certain things that this subpopulation has that the others don't have, and then there's substantial genetic variance between that population and other populations who are supposed to be of the same species. That's what we call a subspecies. Human populations simply don't make that. They don't do that. They don't show these kind of characteristics. And so people pretty much are dropping the concept of race applied to human beings. But as Ta-Nehisi Coates told you, race is the child of racism, not the father. All right, is everybody with that? Race is the child of racism, not the father. So even though we have no compelling evidence for what we call human subspecies, doesn't fit the biology definition, race, the child, may be fading, but the father is alive and well. All right? So how do you define racism? What do we talk about when we define racism? A couple of definitions up here. I like the idea of an oppressive system of racial relations justified by ideology. All right, one group benefiting from the domination of another. All right. Second one, Shelley P. Harrell, who also has some interesting kinds of theories on this. She says it's a system of dominance, power, and privilege based on racial group designations that's rooted in historical oppression. Maulana Karenga talks about the denial or deforming of the history and human expression of a people based on the false concept of race. Another definition. There's a variety of them out there, but what it comes down to is that they want to kill us dead in the streets for sure. Racism looks something like this when you diagram it. This is from one of our graduate students, Tanisha Burford, who now teaches at Hampton. But there are structural forms of racism that exist even if the individual racism fades, comes, and goes. Sometimes people are mean, sometimes they're not. All right? Sometimes people call you names, sometimes they don't. But structural, institutional, policy, and cultural racism exist independent of that, and structural racism is sort of in the middle of this whole matrix when we look at it. This is interesting because when we talk about memes and the minds of people, these are certain sources of racism will impact a variety of areas of our thinking. One area we talk about is our cultural historical memory. It'll also impact our sense of competence, whether or not we can do things effectively, and it'll impact our overall body image, whether or not we think there's something wrong with the way we look. Do we need to change our overall appearance? It affects those. And what I want you to recognize is no matter what area you are in, what area you're studying, what your major is, you can take those areas and study racism's effect within that particular area. So if you go biological, if you're in biology, you can study those aspects in a biological perspective. You can also, if you're into something like sociology, look at it interpersonally, that these things actually exist within what we call a model where they're repeated over and over again, racism existing at all levels of society like this. Take home on racism, just look, we know that it's a persistent power-mediated phenomena, and the interpersonal aspects of it are only the tip of the iceberg. There's a variety of other aspects of it. It can be experienced consciously or unconsciously, all right? And it impacts all aspects of our lives, all right? But what do we do about it? That's the diagnosis. What do we do about it in terms of the treatment side of this thing? Let's move a little bit toward what we'll call the healing process. All right, again, definitions. Resistance is an important aspect of what we're going to be talking about. How do we resist this whole process? These are what we call actions or ideas, memes again, whose intention is to disrupt or destroy racism's impact or racism's existence. That's what we call the resistance notion. Restoration and renaissance, that's constructing memes and social structures that nurture optimal human growth and blossoming. All right? How do we get there? How do we get to this point of doing these kinds of things? And if we could, for about 5 minutes, I want us to think psychologically about it. And the model is going to look like this. We need to say something about memory. We need to say something about consciousness, and then something about imagination, and that's going to take us to this whole idea of restoration. Is everybody with me at this point? All right, so psychologically, we're just going to look at these things. You say, well, now we're back in psych class. I'm sorry. We'll do it for a minute. Then we'll come right out of there. All right. Anybody know where this is? Anybody? Somebody hollered out. Memory is an elusive is a selection of images, some elusive, others printed indelibly on the brain. That the summer I killed my father, I was 10 years old. All right, from Eve's Bayou. Interesting study of memory in Eve's Bayou. Ta-Nehisi says something to us about, Ta-Nehisi Coates says something to us about memory that we need to think about. And that is that do not think of enslaved people as bricks on your path to wherever you're going. These were individuals, these were people who were ground up by the American machine. And they were not slaves, these were people. And he wants you to make sure that your memories are clear on that. When we talk about memory, two things. Remember on the model, we're with memory now. When we talk about memory, we want to recognize that, in fact, it has a lot of facets, but the two I want you to think about is that there's certain types of memory that you can talk about, and we call that declarative memory. Those things you can discuss, but then there's deeper memories that you don't necessarily have access to. They affect you, but you don't necessarily have access to them. If you are traumatized, for example, there's a memory of the event, but then there's a deeper writing of that memory in your physiology. So even before you realize you're in the situation where the event occurred, physiologically you started to respond to it. All right? If you're insulted in a classroom, for example, all right? And it really, the next time you go into that classroom, your body responds to it even before you realize, hey, this is the place that bad thing happened to me. All right, these things are they occur almost what we call unconsciously. So our emotional memories have conscious and unconscious parts. The unconscious parts take place faster than the conscious ones. All right? Second thing I want you to remember about memory, and this is a sad story. All psychology majors know of this individual. His name was H.M. We now call him Henry Mollison because he died. This is an individual who had very, very, very severe seizures. All right, one after another, and they couldn't control it with medication. So what they did basically is they did surgery on him, and they took part of his structure called the hippocampus out. All right. Before surgery, he just basically could not function. He'd have to be almost totally anesthetized, and as well as just simply put out of any kind of commission because the seizures would not stop. All right. After the surgery, what happened is that the seizures, of course, were somewhat reduced, but he had no capacity to make a new memory. He couldn't make new memories. So in other words, if you said to H.M., glad to meet you, my name is so-and-so, we'll go over here and go for a little walk, he would be very willing to do that, but the next day when you met him, he would have no memory of you or the walk. All right? And so what people have always said is, well, it looks like there's parts of the brain that are associated with us putting memories in there. There are some other problems, though. He had problems also with old memory. He could remember who he was, but he had problems with a lot of the old memories. He wasn't quite as good with them as normal people would be. He had difficulty, what we call updating memory files, and his imagination had been changed. He didn't have an imagination. He couldn't imagine possibilities beyond what he actually saw. The lessons, memories are dynamic. We continually refresh them. We take them, we refresh them, and they link us to what is possible in the environment. He had lost all three of these things. Part of our memories are conscious, both the unconscious and the conscious ones influence our behavior. We're always updating our memories. We change them. And parts of the brain that form memories are related to the capacity for us to engage in imagination. That'll be important. Okay, second thing, what we'll call social consciousness. That's going to be important to us. All right. Ta-Nehisi Coates gives us a statement about consciousness that he wants us to remember, is that you'll be called crazy for seeing the corruption and smelling the sulfur. You'll be called crazy for realizing that you're in a situation, in a hellified situation. But he says, they'll try to nullify your anger, your fear, until you find yourself really inveighing against the crime in your ghetto because you're powerless before the great crime of history that brought the ghettos to be. All right. This is stuff on consciousness. I think it's important. We're going to talk about consciousness with start off with awareness, and then talk about consciousness with a capital C. It goes through a number of stages. Let's watch them. And like memory and perception, consciousness takes many forms. First thing is, early consciousness is we simply sense the world out there. All right. Then as we grow, we're able to tell that my body is separate from the world. That's a big deal. For a baby, they don't make that distinction. The world out there and their body is basically the same thing. You grow and you move into that notion. Social consciousness is when you realize that other people are me or like me, right? And we share what makes us human. All right? And political consciousness is when we start to realize, hey, others take advantage, other people are controlled based on selfish and aggressive motives. That's what we call social consciousness. I wonder where this was taken. Any ideas? Yeah, this is Harvard University students showing social consciousness. All right, after the death of Michael Brown, aware that what? There they are, Michael Brown. That's part of what we call social consciousness. Last thing, psychologically, imagination. All right? I'm going to say that the brain is constantly processing and reprocessing what we give it. It's constructive and it's always reshaping what's in it. And imagination brings something into being that is largely independent of pre-existing reality. That's what imagination does. All right? Ta-Nehisi talks about a very special imagination of an individual, Robert Hayden, a poet. And he talks about how he could bring forth joy and agony without literally writing the words, which formed as pictures, not as slogans. Interesting imaginations. Left, Donny Hathaway, Quincy Jones. On the right, Gwendolyn Brooks. People of great imaginations, right? Zora Neale Hurston, tremendous imagination, right? Tremendous imagination. And able to, as a scientist, but also as a person who brought into existence tales and stories and realities that didn't exist before. Interesting picture. Mali on the left-hand side, this is in Mali, sketched in rock, probably between 10 and 20,000 years ago. At the time this was put into rocks, the Sahara Desert, where it is actually now, was in fact a savanna. It was that long ago. But individuals had the imagination and actually created that. This is what Africans did there, and we're now trying to figure ways to preserve that expression of imagination. It's a product. Right-hand side, Trini people, anybody? What are those? If you hear steel drums, pan, when you hear pan music, the next time you hear music, you'll say, where's the pan? Very recently invented instrument in Trinidad, all right, that shows how people can make something out of what appears to be nothing, all right? That's all part of the imagination. This is a conference that we started in psychology 20 years ago. Had the imagination that we do it. Monique Major did this painting of it, and that conference has been going on for the last 20 years, just because somebody imagined it could happen, and it actually comes into being. On the left, if you leave Howard without hearing this man play piano, you should be, you can hear him play for free, and he can connect for you. He can connect for you gospel music, what you call gospel, and what I call African classical music. Some people call it jazz. He can connect those to you with one hand and then with the other hand and with both hands. Cyrus Chestnut. On the right-hand side, Achille Anderson. Two of the windows in the chapel came out of his imagination. And you'll see them down at in Rankin Chapel. Another superior imagination. All right. Summary statements about imagination. ranks with the highest forms of human brain activity. Works with but transcends memory, perception, and consciousness. Mental substance of creativity brings new things into existence. It works like this. This is how the model works. Memory affects imagination, affects consciousness. Imagination will eventually affect resistance and restoration. That's how the model flows. All right, that's how the model flows. That's enough psychology for one day. All right? This is part 2B, strategies and tactics. Efforts to disrupt or destroy racism's impact or existence, stomping out mimetic infections. That's one thing, that's one strategy. And the other is constructing memes and social structures that nurture optimal human growth. That's the other side of what we're going to do. Again, Ta-Nehisi's statement on this one that I want you all to think about. You are the bearer of a body more fragile than any other in this country. You know what he means by that. All right? What I want you to know is that it's not your fault, even if it is ultimately your responsibility. It's your responsibility, our responsibility, to do something about it. Resistance and restoration emerge from what we know and from what we can imagine. Is everybody all right on that? Resistance, all right, and restoration, they really are tied in with what we can imagine, what we can say can exist, more so than what actually is. I want us to think about it in terms of what we know. I want us to think about it in terms of what we consume, and I want us to think about what we commit to. Those three aspects of resistance, I think we should at least try to deal with. And what we know, study the migrations. Make certain, and Isabel Wilkerson came out of our School of Communications here, but her story about the migrations of people. Very, very important to study these, and of course the Jacob Lawrence series talks about these. But this particular book, The Warmth of Other Suns, will give you an idea of how people resisted what was called Jim Crow in those days, but what we call vulgar racism today. Need to know that. But let's lighten up for a minute. I want you to imagine just for a minute what it would be like if black people ran an airline. That would be funny. All right? If we were running the airline, all right? All right. Has anybody seen Soul Plane? Lighten up. That's yeah. It's going to be in what we know, right? In what we know. We did run an airline, and the airline was called what? Air Atlanta in 1984. All right. Operated for 3 years, served major East Coast cities. Every seat on that airline was considered a first-class seat. Meals were served on china. It had a perfect service record. All right. Without the knowledge of that, we believe Soul Plane. All right. Without the knowledge of that, that's where our resistance has to stop with Soul Plane. Perfect safety, and many of the innovations you see in airlines today are traced directly back to that particular enterprise. This is the individual who did Michael Hollis, who actually started that airline, had the imagination to start that airline. It's in what we consume, and what we consume is extremely important to recognize. That can be a form of resistance. What we watch, basically what we know about television stations, it's still a white man's world. About 70% of television stations are owned by whites, mostly males. And what we hear, independent labels represent maybe 12%. The rest is owned by, the rest of what we listen to is really controlled by large companies. All right? But there are alternatives out there. There are alternatives out there to what we consume. There's a persistent production of authentic art. Step up and try to consume it. Fruitvale Station, all right? Authentic art, right? That's part of what it's produced. If you haven't seen Fruitvale Station, make sure you see that. Somebody said this story needs to be told. The imagination says this story will allow us to resist what's coming on from these large companies, and that's what he did. Ava DuVernay, you know her from, she directed Selma, and you know that you can also find her work if you dig hard enough in an independent film called Middle of Nowhere. Both very important films, Middle of Nowhere being an independent film that you need to consume this because that's where, in fact, you can get out of what's being pushed to us by the mainstream. Stanley Nelson's recent film on Black Panthers, interesting film because, in fact, it tries to tell one story that's a very complex story. He's only telling a little part of it, but you can now go down to E Street and see it, all right, if you get off the beaten track. In the commitments that we make, resistance takes form in the commitments that we make. There is political science majors in here. There is an individual that you need to get to know. His name was Ronald Walters. And Ron Walters was, in fact, chair of political science. And he would basically ask this question that maybe we should ask when we get up in the morning and we're about to engage in some act. And the question is, what's that got to do with the liberation of black people? All right? We do a lot of things, we engage in a lot of actions that, in fact, may be counterproductive to it. And his institute now resides on Howard's campus, an institute where, in fact, you can find all of his writings and you can find a lot of his ideas. Important to recognize that, yeah, it's in these kind of individuals, the commitments that these type of individuals make that sort of moves us forward. That's great, but Thabo Sefolosha was found, that's great that Thabo Sefolosha was found not guilty, but he shouldn't have been the one on trial. NYPD should have been on trial. Anybody know what this refers to? Thabo Sefolosha, NBA player whose leg was broken by the NYPD last spring for no reason. They asked him to cop a plea to disorderly conduct and everything would be forgotten, misdemeanor. He said, no, we're going to take this thing to trial. And in fact, it was found that they had no reason to break his leg. He couldn't participate in the playoffs because of the fact that his leg had been broken. And this one, every time she opens her mouth, a self-hating, I like this term, cringe-worthy statement comes out. These are from an individual that we used to call this individual, Eton Thomas, was called the poet in the pivot. He was an NBA player for about 9 years, all right, and is now committed to sort of telling a different story with the millions he made as an NBA player. His book, Fatherhood, interesting things he says in that. One of the most beautiful things about fatherhood is that it teaches you to be selfless. All right? That's the thing with kids. Time stops when they're not happy. That's poetry in the pivot. All right? His commitment has been to not necessarily just using those millions to consume products, it's to somehow put out new ideas. HU Alternative Spring Break, commitments that we make. This is a ongoing process with students at Howard University. The spring break becomes not a time to sort of consume products from the mainstream. In fact, what happens with Alternative Spring Break is that we try to provide some sort of service to those individuals out there who are under oppression's heel. All right? Commitments that we make. All right. Black Lives Matter. Another attempt to commit to, at least in some way, pushing back against what we call racism in all of its forms. Each generation finds its mission. You'll find it. All right. And because of that, we're going to be all right. They saw you, and they saw me. Thank you.